first speaker for today, and that's Stuart Carter, who's the president of the Munibung Hill Conservation Society. Stuart's going to be talking to us about the deep time story for Munibung Hill.
So if you'd like to join the Munibung Hill Conservation Society, there's a form. If you'd like a printed version, in a sort of summary sense of what I'm doing today, then there's a little sheet. I'd like to acknowledge Birabaan, since Birabaan was a significant person within the history of Munibung Hill. And if I just put the microphone down for a moment and just put a little image on the front desk. So we live in the universe. That's the outer circle. And then we've got the supernovas and the galaxies. And then we've got the solar system. And then we've got the Earth, or the ecology. Then the society. And we're told that we in fact don't live in any of them. We live in an economy. And so we're suggesting that we need to rethink the story. So one of the major references for anything that I present now is The Dream of the Earth with Thomas Berry, who talks about we need another story. So it would have been about a year ago when I was walking the hill and I thought, who's going to look after the hill? If nobody does, then it'll just continue on for the next 251 million years, because that's how old the hill is. So let's begin. This is a bit like a book. Anne tells me I don't have long. The last time I presented this, it went for an hour and a half. That was to two people who asked a lot of questions. So it starts like a book. It's got a bit of a preface, and then it goes into the main section, and ends with a summary, of course. So the people on the screen are Bruce Pascoe and Bill Gemmage. Did anybody go to the Newcastle Writers' Festival? Then Bruce Pascoe was there. And Bruce Pascoe also did a session with a fellow by the name of Charles Massey. Charles Massey's written a book called The Call of the Reed Warbler. It's an amazing story. And it applies to all of us, and unless we get a grip on the call of the reed warbler, then we're in trouble in the future. So these two gentlemen are important references in this story. So my motivation is that unless somebody leads, nobody will. And so why not us? And that was said by Ray Anderson, the founder of Interface, the largest carpet manufacturing company in the world. We have carpets made by that company in our house. And so what will be the storyline that continues on for Munibung Hill if we leave it the way it is? Sadly, it probably will die out. In one sense it'll die out, but it'll only die out in terms of the human component of the earth. It won't die out at all, in fact, because it will remain with all of those other beings that live on the hill. Because the hill is not vacant, it's not unoccupied, it's not just a bit of land waiting for some developer. It's actually a living landscape. There's a new book on the box, Billy Griffith's Deep Time Dreaming, and so I think it's worthwhile us thinking that Munibung Hill came 251 million years ago, back before Australia split away from the supercontinent Pangaea. And a range of hills we now know as Munibung Hill was important in the spiritual and ceremonial life of the Awabakal people. I sometimes pass over this slide because some people find it offensive, but we'll give it a go. Sadly, we see ourselves as consumers, or at least that's what we're told we are, where in fact we need to be communers. We need to see ourselves as integral with the land, not the dominant species. And to quote Charles Massey, we need to be regenerative rather than extractive. So we need to retell the story, and then to match the story, we need to redirect our energies and the way we go about our business. So one of the dreams that we have for Munibung Hill is that it's the centre for an observatory and a planetarium within the Newcastle Lake Macquarie area. That's one of our dreams and our visions. And we're basing that vision on the Auckland Star Dome, if you like to have a look at it. On the net, it's a wonderful place, and that's an image at the bottom of the screen. Now, I only put this image in last night because I thought, since you're a deep-thinking lot, then we can acknowledge each other as just little bits of stardust, because that's what we are. And after we're gone, we'll return to the stardust realm to come back as another piece of stardust in another being, whatever that being happens to be. I would never have dreamt of talking like this 20 years ago. My mother and father, who were extremely religious people, would probably be wondering who I am today. But there you go. So that's the preliminaries. Now we're going to do the unfolding story of Munibung Hill. So I'd like to acknowledge the Awabakal people as custodians of the land and show our respects to the knowledge holders and as being the trustees. Now the piece of poetry on the right is for when I show this in a business setting with a business community, because the piece of poetry on the right was written for that fellow I referenced earlier, Ray Anderson, by one of his staff, because he said, unless we actually run our societies and our corporations in terms of tomorrow's children, then we might as well say goodbye, because it's tomorrow's children that we need to be thinking about today. So these are just some of the references that I've been able to fit onto one slide. On the left is the more academic and research-based ones. On the right are the existing reports from Lake Macquarie City Council. There you are, John.
Oh my God.
You've got half a slide, mate.
I'm in very honoured company there.
So this presentation is going to be delivered again tonight at Warners Bay Rotary Club. It's already been delivered to the Charlestown Lions Club. It's been to all of the Aboriginal land councils. So I'm just getting around to as many people as possible to tell the story. So we're talking about that area of land. So I'm a newcomer, I've only been here 3 or 4 years. People would know about Munibung, the area?
Yes, we know about
Yes.
Munibung.
Have you walked it? Who's walked
Many
Munibung?
times.
Walked many times?
Taken lots of kids there too.
Wonderful. Well, I need to speak with you at some stage. Who hasn't walked Munibung? Well, the rest haven't walked Munibung. It's worth a walk, and it would be our dream that in the coming years it'll be one of those must go-to places that we have on our calendar. So there's lots of plans for Munibung Hill, and we need to be part of that planning process. So I've called this the custody map, because that's who controls the hill at the moment. So the yellow and the orange is in the hands of Lake Macquarie City Council. The white is in the hands of PASMICO and rehabilitation, and the orange is operational land that used to be with Telstra and Optus. It's now with Lake Macquarie City Council. So regardless of whether, and the green, the rest of it is in a private holding corporation with the Hawkins family. But regardless of who owns what, we believe it's an extremely significant piece of landscape in this area, and for it to be lost to anything other than public land would be an absolute shame. That I think other people would, in years to come, would ask, what on earth were they doing? So this is a set of slides now talking about the deep time in terms of Indigenous history and culture as it relates to Munibung Hill. If we get it in perspective, then Uluru is 500 million years old and Munibung is 250 million. So we're talking pre-dinosaur time. And we're talking pre-breaking away from Gondwana land and from the supercontinent Pangaea. So Munibung came 17 million years before that split. So the geology of the lake that everybody loves and goes to visit is rather interesting because Munibung is 251 million years old and the lake's only 6,000 years old. So when you talk about this in terms of human generations, we've got Munibung being at 10 million generations. And we've been here in this country, us white Western Europeans have been here for 9 generations. We begin to get a perspective of what it is that we're talking about and where it is that perhaps we fit in. So 26,000 years ago, things started to shift and the sea level stabilised at 6,000 years. And all of those Aboriginal people who lived around Toronto, all around where we now call those foreshore suburbs of Lake Macquarie, they would have watched that valley fill and adapted to it. So it was a very prominent place, that whole area, and of course Munibung became more prominent because it was the place then where they communicated with tribes and groups in other places because of its elevation. So Lake Macquarie has the second largest Indigenous population in New South Wales. And a lot of sites, but many of them have been, to quote Bruce Pascoe, scrubbed out. So we'll get to that a little later, or not so much later perhaps. So Bruce says that just because there's no evidence of our presence on the surface doesn't mean that Indigenous people weren't here. It often means that their evidence of being there was scrubbed out. And then this allows us to go ahead and do whatever we like, which of course has been the case. So the evidence, we believe, is there in terms of the ceremonial grounds, the middens, the ochre quarry, and the stone arrangements. And the word that Bruce Pascoe uses to describe much of what we try to bring into this story in terms of Indigenous history, the word he uses is flaky. He's always accused of being flaky. And I think that I'm sort of being accused of being flaky a lot of the time. But he calls it now, as well as being flaky, that's what other people call it, he says it's muscular. It's what we need to do. We need to stand up and tell the truth, because this is the truth. And not only is it the truth, that we've just spoken about, that we can actually verify it through the records. And of course, when he wrote Dark Emu, the records were those of the authorities and of the settlers' diaries. So Munibung becomes for us in this part of New South Wales a visible and tangible connection to a living culture. Now, I'll just skip through these slides because they're not quite as relevant, but Thomas Berry would say that everything is integral with everything else, so you can't sort of take one bit out and ignore the rest, otherwise we're not left with the whole as nature would have intended. But the hill is a significant place because of its opportunities for astronomy, hydrology, geology, ecology, society and economy. So the vegetation community is important. Eucalyptus trees have been here for 109 million years, and so they are an integral part of our past and our being today. As is the animal community, and we're losing our native species as we speak. In our time, on our watch, these animals are disappearing, and it will be tragic, I think, if all we have to show our children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren is pictures and slides of what was here before and what's not here now because of this species. The squirrel glider that Lake Macquarie City Council commissioned an 80-page report on in 2015 hasn't been seen there since the report was published. We often look at a tree and say, oh well, there's a tree. Every tree is an important tree. Even a dead tree is an extremely significant tree, and in fact a tree that's not 80 to 100 years old hasn't reached its full potential yet, because a tree that hasn't lost a limb hasn't provided a hollow, because hollows are required for 30% of our mammals and birds. No home, no nest, no eggs, no babies, no species, and we are diminished as a result. So these are the tracks and trails that have been proposed for the hill. I'm going too fast, say so. A couple of people down in Farm Street have spent the last 20 years doing restoration on their end of the hill. We think that was the place where Virabhan actually visited and communicated with fellow tribes in the area. These are the access points from Macquarie Road. All the visitor signs are being ignored. And when you get to the top, you see this massive panorama as far north as Port Stephens, as far south as Swansea, across to Newcastle and the beaches. It's just an opportunity waiting to be accessed, really. If only we had a vision, collectively and at a government level, to take advantage of it. So if you want to go for a walk up the hill, the best place to start is from Farm Street. in Spears Point. And then there's a second lookout on the southwestern side, and it would be from the Quarry Road lookout, and that lets you look out across Valentine, up to Sugarloaf, around to Boolaroo, and across Lake Macquarie. Of course, the largest plants on the earth also exist at Munibung Hill, and without them, well, they were here so much earlier than us that it's just not funny. Fungi are on the hill in their massive numbers, and without them, there'd be no human society. So the hill, we're saying, is not only a place to look from, but it's a place to look to, because it's like a reference point in terms of its age and history. And these are the people who currently visit the hill. So the stargazing event at Spears Point, 700 people turned up to that. There was an amazing buzz. And we've just put on a marketing company to promote the hill, and that'll be launched in about a fortnight. I don't know if anybody's got any grandchildren that go bushwalking and hunting and treasure hunting. The old orienteering days are over, and it would seem, and now people go looking for treasure using their GPS with their longitude and latitude for treasures, and they call it geocaching. It's an international movement. Commissioned art that was done some years ago has now gone overseas, and as part of this whole process we're saying there needs to be some care, repair, recover, recognition, reconciliation. So Birabam was presented with a nameplate or a brass plate by the Governor, Sir Ralph Darling, to recognise his contribution to translating the Awabakal language into English. So he was classified as one of the more significant people within Aboriginal society. We think that one of the things that could happen would be a story map that would involve a whole range of activities, but what we're basing it on is this story map prepared by the University of Tasmania, and we visited Tasmania about 6 weeks ago, and looked up the Tasmanian website for their story map, and visited about 20 of their 60 sites. It was just wonderful, just wonderful. So we would love to think that you would be involved in that process. Then I go through a series of slides on remediation, so I'll just quickly go through those. Anybody goes jogging, there's a Swedish concept now called plogging, where you go jogging with a plastic bag and you pick up rubbish. So jogging with a purpose. Our eldest son lives in Sweden, so we tend to have a bit of an affinity with what happens in that place. We think it's a wonderful opportunity to rewrite the story and to talk about education. when I was at Warners Bay High School the other day, some of the teachers there were very excited about what we could do in terms of the curriculum. For us, this has repercussions that go out into the suburbs. What we need to do is get rid of our couch grass, get rid of our kikuyu, and put in native grasses. There's some wonderful grasses, and bring back some diversity into the suburbs. And the hill could be our inspiration. Of course, we need to get rid of cats and foxes, and the list goes on. And this is the opportunity to rewrite the stories that we currently have, because they started in 1788. And that's our fivefold vision for the hill, which is on the back of the membership form if you'd like to take one. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stuart. That was fantastic. I thought when you were talking about a Bura band in those various locations and the combination of using technology in some of those areas, I immediately thought of our innovation team with regards to augmented reality, whereby you could actually create or put in to the landscape through a person's mobile phone or some mobile device, a reenactment or something, or there's enough sort of lines out of Threlkeld to create those connections.
That'd be fantastic.
And so where's all this at the moment? I mean, in terms of what you've got, obviously you've got a marketing people doing something, so you've got some pretty good organisation around all this.
Yes, we're in an interesting situation because of the ownership of the hill, and people sort of have a hands-off approach. That means that there's supposedly a vacuum, but I'm always of the opinion that a vacuum never remains a vacuum for long, and it often goes, sadly, to the lowest common denominator. So it's my and our committee's intention to ramp up the discussion. And my name, Carter, what's this Carter character? That's what I was told by Simon the other day over at Delight and Crow City Council. Carter's in the building and always wanting to see staff. What's he want to see staff about? You know, why is he going to see councillors? So this presentation in an earlier form has been shown to 8 of the 12 councillors, the mayor, and I've tried to get to see the general manager, but without success. Having said that, there's now to be a major briefing paper prepared for councillors, because Carter, you know, is annoying us, and we need to sort him out. So our intention is to sort him out by actually getting something positive happening. And so the only way to do that is to create a community of interest. Because at the end of the day, what we're talking about is our budget. That's how the world works. We do live here, but the economy is what drives it. And unless there's a budget line, nothing happens. It's just as simple as that. Okay. So we now have to create a community of interest, because we have to compete with a caravan park or a boat jetty or a shopping centre or a high-rise set of flats or whatever. That's what we have to. We're not talking big money though. We're just talking about, you know, priorities and re-engaging and so on and so forth. So the idea is we get a community of interest, so that's why I'm coming here. I've gone to the 3 Aboriginal land councils, Miramar, going to the Rotary Club and Lions Club, you know, getting some business places on board. To be done in the Astronomical Society is very important. So we bring all these people on board, and then they can't ignore me, because there's all these other people. So that's the strategy. It's an Andrew Denton strategy that I use, and he's very successful when he takes on a lobbying position. So I think what you're saying, John, is absolutely wonderful. It was working well, and if we could just get you to, you know, put that down on paper,
Yeah.
just as a little one-page blurb,
Well,
and add it to our submission, that would be fantastic.
well, that would be. Well, we could do a blog post on this if you like, and incorporate the presentation. I've got you filmed your presentation, so we can put that in there as well.
Natural history.
And we've got students that are looking for projects, community projects like this. I mean, if you want to talk to Anne, she can weave in something with the work integrated learning ideas, and also meet with the innovation team here, and they can suggest on the spot things that can be done, give you an idea of budgets to make it real, so that you can go and inform council about them. But okay, questions from the floor?
I'd like to say I'm so thrilled to see this because I started on this in 1960 at Cardiff High School, and the Cardiff High School magazine is Munibung, right? And you must go to the Cardiff High School people and start talking to them. And the Cardiff High School, because it was Munibung and it was the Aboriginal Association, they did they made their house names Aboriginal names.
Wonderful.
That unfortunately they're taken from the Warburton Mountains because they could only find that particular Aboriginal place at the time in 1960, I think it was, when the school started. But and of course I used to take my orienteering kids there all the time, and also my landscape art people, because it's a wonderful site from Newcastle, but it was always, we had to go, be very careful, go across private property, and of course from the other side you had one of the worst polluters in the area, and one of the reasons why that smelter was built out there was because it was well away from Newcastle, and they didn't mind them, but they caused so much trouble.
Thank you very much. We must meet.
Russell?
My background is in geology and mapping. A couple of comments. One, you may want to bring in. You may want to think that the top of the hill is actually the Permian, very close to the Permian-Triassic boundary, which is the biggest mass extinction in the history of life on Earth, which is certainly a focus in with some of the things you're talking about present day, as long as we don't cause the biggest mass extinction. Secondly, as I mentioned, background is mapping and orienteering, coincidentally. So if you're interested in getting some as good a base map as you're going to want, come and talk to me. And also I've got some comments about the actual dates for the sea level rises and changes. So talk to you later.
Thank you. I'll take it off in your offer.
I started the idea off with some knowledge of Florence Austral from my mother's interest in opera. So this woman, we cared for her in the latter part of her life, but she actually came from Melbourne, so we can't claim her as our own, but I think we can claim that we were very helpful in her latter years. But being involved in Newcastle Year 3A, towards the end of last year there was a call for topics for this year's presentation, and I had this Austral name bouncing around in my head for good reason. I might tell you about shortly. And I volunteered to actually start preparing a presentation. But as I started doing that, I started to look at what the story was about, and there was a catalyst in my knowledge of this woman. In as much as my mother had a 1926 edition of a book called Opera at Home, which was published by the Gramophone Company, later known as HMV and then later known as EMI, and it listed the records of the 1920s, and there weren't many, but they were significant. And this book was always around in the house with Mum. By the way, that's a photo of one I found on the internet. Mum's volume I've still got is in much poorer condition than that one. But nevertheless, it certainly reminds me of what it was about. This is the reason I have this lady in my mind, the lady with the spear, very impressive actually, spear and the shield. And she died in Newcastle in 1968. Let's get my bearings. At that period, we were living in New Lambton, and Mum would have surely mentioned this because she had a long-standing interest in opera and a knowledge of this woman, and that photo was in the book. So that was cemented in my memory, and then I got this idea of doing a presentation, and I guess out of a knowledge that she spent her decline years in Newcastle, and I knew a bit about the story from having done a little bit of reading, and then I put the idea forward and it was accepted, and then I did a bit of a panic because I'm not qualified to talk about opera and voice. So I got Hiliary, now pardon me, just before I go to that step, I put this slide in today, I couldn't resist it. The frontispiece of the book was that garland with Enrico Caruso in the image there, and on the right is a pencil sketch of Enrico Caruso that was in our household effects, and it's actually a pencil sketch drawn by Bill Dobell. And again, there's a story in that one. A cousin of Mum's lived in the same street as Bill Dobell. We're talking about circa 1930 for that one. You can see how the photo inspired the sketch. So, researching the story, I asked Hiliary, who's a member of the same group, to participate in the activity, and that was a really good decision because she's eminently qualified and enthusiastic. And so, at the end of the last year, December, we both launched out on research somewhat separately. We knew what we wanted, we were looking for. We were looking for good information, and I did some research up here in Newcastle. Hiliary will speak for herself shortly. Did research in the National Library, but we both realised we had a really interesting story, and we were talking about someone who is worthy of perhaps more recognition in Australia's who's who, I guess I'm saying. She had a very ordinary start. She had an extraordinary talent. So, but her actual active career was truncated by the Great War, and then the Depression, and also a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis when she was around 40 years of age. So, quite a deal of sadness in the story. We did 2 sessions for U3A, and as this was all coming together, the idea gained traction through some blogs being set up on the National Library's website, and Hiliary would like to talk about that aspect of it.
No, what happens though, because of family, I go to Canberra quite frequently, and I was at the National Library and they said it's the 50th anniversary of the opening of the library, and I said, oh, that's great, and they said they've got this presentation, and of course there was the Seekers and Bee Gees, and I said, where's Florence? And at any rate, we got talking, and so they said, would you like to be on our, what's it called, Instagram, the 50th year? And I said, sure. So they took a photo of me, and I'm on the Instagram, and then he approached me and said, would you like to write a blog about Florence Austral? I said, sure, you know, and so I wrote it. He said it had to be only 700 words. So, you know, cutting it down and putting pictures in. And then he rang me and said, could you do, you know, two blogs? And I said, sure. So it became 2 blogs, and it created quite a bit of interest. And furthermore, it gave us credibility. We people realise that this is really a valuable story, and it should be told, not only in Newcastle but Australia-wide, and also perhaps worldwide. And the interesting part about it also is that, shall I talk about one of the ladies at the U3A? She writes on a message board, and so she sent this this blog to the message board in New York, and I called it Florence Austral, Australia's Forgotten Diva. And the man wrote back and said, well, she's not forgotten here. And as to date, there are 1,327 hits on that message board about Florence Austral. And that gives an indication of how there is interest there. It just needs to be, brought out into the fore. Her recordings, she made 155 tracks, and some have not been released because she didn't like the way some of it was performed. But since Warren has digitised some of the recordings, I urge you to go on YouTube and listen to some of it, because the voice is truly glorious.
You can see how that book influenced the project for me. The photo there of Florence Austral, I digitised the garland and inserted Florence into the image there as a tribute to her technology. The story appeared to be Australian woman around about 30, went to London, was successful, made recordings, and then her career was somewhat truncated by illness. We found it was much more complex and much more interesting than we first thought as far as the skill of this lady and her success and her road to success. But certainly World War I had a significant impact on her ability to get to Europe. It also meant she had an extended period seemingly of conservatorium training, which may have gave her the skills to learn the libretto and also approach a number of different scenarios. But certainly in those early years, and I'm talking about 1916, 1918, she was recognised as having Wagnerian soprano skills. In other words, she had a powerful voice and she could carry those sort of roles. And they became the roles she was most recognised for, as well as some other ones that needed powerful singing skills. That's Hilary's area. But certainly by 1919 there was a benefit concert to send to the US at this stage, to the Met. The Met didn't work out terribly well for whatever reason, and she ended up going to Great Britain, and she got engaged there, and she then took the stage name Austral, and basically she started and was recognised very, very quickly as a skilled singer, and basically gained acclaim very early in her career.
I'll just interrupt there and just say that when she auditioned for Covent Garden, because she was a bit reluctant to do that, the first aria she sang was Aida, and she said, I really took the roof off. And then the second thing she sang was from Tannhäuser, and again it was just a marvellous experience. And they paid her, now this is 1920, she was paid £30 a week to learn the ring cycle. So that's just gives you an indication of how keen, because they said, this is exactly what we're waiting for. This is what we've been looking for, is someone who can sing this. She sang for Royal Albert Hall. They heard her, and in total, she sang there 24 times. And at one time in 1932, in front of the King George V and Queen Mary.
And that was Queen Mary's 65th birthday celebration event. But notice she changed her name to Austral. I haven't ever said this publicly. I'm inclined to take this into stride and refer to her as Florence Nostril. So that's not on the record, Johnny.
It's on the record now.
No, forgive me, but the impact she made, and one of the next significant things in the record after this Wagner debut, I should say, was her singing as a replacement artist without rehearsal in
this was in the Rig Cycle, and her compatriot, whose name was Else Australia, it was the De Valkyrie, and if you go can you flip back?
Of course they do.
There she is, hey! Now this is the costume that she wore for De Valkyrie. Now the breastplate, which has got another name, was too tight for her, and she was taller than Else Australia, so she's got that white bit skirt hitched up with safety pins. And she'd rehearsed the first act and part of the second act, but hadn't done the third act at all. So that is, and to give you an idea, people have poo-pooed her, but she must have had an extraordinary memory, because to go on and to perform that, now perhaps she was criticised for her poor acting skills, but heavens to Betsy, I've seen some pretty lousy opera singers, but, I'm sure that they would have told her, just stand there, love, and and sing, which is exactly what she would have done, and a glorious voice that she had, and also she had the agility. See, she could sing these, the battle cry, which is what she became famous for, and after this performance, she got 11 standing ovations, solo ovations, 11. This is quite extraordinary. Anyway, moving on. Sorry.
No, so she hit the boards very effectively in London, and she was travelling around Europe, and by the mid-20s she made journeys to North America. Also, there was a relationship going on with a married man who knew her in Melbourne, and I've selected just very few slides from our presentation that we gave at U3A, but I'll include the one about the scandal just to give context. There was no confession on television Sunday night or that, but she was cited in a divorce case because she was living with this married man. The divorce case was in Melbourne, and the divorce was granted, and without sort of passing any judgment on the situation. I think some of the pressures on the people of that era were brought about by the mores and values of the era. And there's one thing that's cited in a lot of the records, that she was denied attendance at a three choirs festival at Worcester Cathedral. And there was a bubbling series of things in the press. And by the way, the National Library's Trove resource has just been wonderful in this one. And we're going to talk about the reference materials that we have accessed as well.
Thank you, Jude Conway.
Yes, here.
This is the Bible that we used when Austral sang. The other book by James Moffat is erroneous, but this is the book that has got a lot of detail. It's hard to read, but it's certainly I would not have been able to write that blog without this book. It's excellent.
Yeah, the resource is comprehensive, and it was only published about 10 years ago, so it's very much resource in context with the history.
Out of print, yeah, I think it's out of print. Yeah.
Another slide here is
Elphinstone.
We haven't really properly introduced John Amadio. He was a virtuoso flautist. And he didn't seem to like being in the orchestra team. He liked to be at the front of the stage, so he was very much to the fore in concerts that Florence gave in conjunction with others. And he seems like he was a bit of a flash man around town. By the way, in preparing these things, I'm very keen in the visual, and I came across a photo of the actual ship they came to Australia in 1934, and I couldn't resist it. They wouldn't have been on the ship because they got off at Fremantle, but there's the Sydney Harbour Bridge. This must be 1930 actually, it was earlier. The graphics that I found were quite interesting too, to illustrate the significance of the woman in her career in the 1920s. 1930 was the significant year for her and her health. She had a Wagnerian engagement with the Berlin Opera, which was sought after, and it turned Turkey. And we're talking about end of 1930. The true story did not come out till 1961, when I believe the way it transpired, a guy came from the Record Collector magazine in England, and he was doing interviews in Australia, and she gave an indication that she had a fall while performing in an opera in Berlin, and that was what caused her to be dismissed from a contract in Berlin. Elphinstone has done, in this book we've just mentioned, has done forensic research and realised that what had been commented over the years was wrong about how that scenario developed. So it became quite significant, 30 years on, and it wasn't truly analysed on to near on 80 years on from the event.
I think we have to also take into account in the 1960s, the poor darling was suffering from multiple sclerosis, which also can impact on the brain. And, we all don't remember dates exactly or what we've done, and she had been so prolific. I can't imagine, it makes me dizzy to think how much singing she did in a week. And for example, when she was singing, she sang at Crystal Palace, and in there, I've got to go backwards, don't I? Crystal Palace, she sang from Maccabeus, and she got this massive ovation, and which was not acceptable in those days at the Crystal Palace. But at Crystal Palace also, she sang the Beethoven's Requiem and the Beethoven's Ninth. And at that time, they had something like 2,500 choristers used to come from all over England to sing at Crystal Palace. That's quite remarkable. Sorry, I had to put that in.
Yeah, no, look, so this history, and again the forensicness of this reference we're talking about, forensicness, if that's the right terminology, has allowed a perspective to be gleaned on this woman's success and also the travail she had. But certainly, ambitious tours to Australia. There was a tour in 1930, and then there was a tour over 2 years in Australia, 1934, 35 into 36. That's significant because it was very successful in Australia, and then back to New Zealand, through North America, back to Europe.
And they kept the MS secret. It wasn't.
Yeah, that's a good thing. The true nature of the MS was kept secret for 30 years. In their return to England, they discovered they were no longer, or particularly Austral was no longer important as an artist. So she lost that ranking because others had filled gaps in companies of opera and so on. So there was a significant change, but something that we haven't mentioned yet, she was a very significant pioneering recording artist in the 1920s. Very significant because she had a very powerful voice, and she was able to, it seems that she was able to handle the technology of acoustic recording, and then she transitioned to electric recording. We're talking about 1924-25. Her recording career came to an end in 1930 when HMV failed to renew her contract, and she recorded only one track beyond that time. And again, Elphinstone suggests this was another one of the series of things that complicated her life, and certainly were challenges that became somewhat insurmountable. So despite her success, it wasn't ongoing.
It wasn't just because of her voice going off or anything like that. It was because HMV, it was the Depression and people weren't buying records, And then radio came in.
That's right.
Yeah, when did radio?
Very much a transition, many transition era issues. I found this in one of the journals, and I thought it was a classic caricature and celebrity of the woman. And the pianist there, he was a Belgian guy known in Australian eyes as Ray Lambert, and he ended up teaching at the Melbourne Con. And one of the coordinators of our U3A music group was a student of his. So things go. So the vocal decline, and I'm mindful of time, the vocal decline due to an MS did start to become very apparent in the late 30s. Thankfully, her periods of remission from the problem, or when it was passive, allowed her to perform fairly solidly through the 1930s. But certainly by the end of the 30s, her concert and operatic career had come to an end. Personal issues with relationship came into play as well. This painting's significant, Hillary?
Yes, this painting is in the National Portrait Gallery. It was at the con, but it's been donated by the university to the National Gallery, and it's proudly presented there. The other portrait, which I'm trying to get out of storage, is the one that was commissioned by William Bowmore, who was an art connoisseur here, a philanthropist, and he commissioned an Italian artist to paint her from a photograph of Tosca, and then he graciously donated that painting to the Conservatorium, where it was hung until just recently, and my project is to get it out of storage and get it rehung.
I've got to apologise to Florence too. That's a full-length portrait, and I had to crop that.
He cut her off.
So by 1945, she started to think of coming back to Australia. She was living in Great Britain during the war. Came back to Australia, to Melbourne, which is her hometown. She could not sing to actually avail herself of something she hoped to do, was sing on the radio with the ABC. That never transpired. Back in Australia in 1946, and then she got work at the Melbourne Con. From what we can read, she didn't seem to fit in down there, and maybe that was her, maybe it was the organisation wasn't terribly friendly. And then one of her colleagues from the 20s was Eugene Goosens, who was the head of the Sydney Conservatorium, Sydney Symphony Orchestra at that time, who had also had oversight of the Newcastle Conservatorium in its foundation, facilitated her coming to Newcastle. So that's the turn as far as where she came to live in this area. Couldn't resist this photo as well. There's Civic Park being used as a car park. Is my laser thing working? There we are, pointing up there to the buildings where the Conservatorium was based before it moved to the old People's Palace. And she seemed to settle in there, but also reading between the lines, she was never a very good teacher. Her pedagogical skills were somewhat lacking or limited, but nevertheless, there was a bit of kindness there in providing her a location to spend a few years at the end of her active career. She then became the sole teacher and must have put a strain on her, sole voice teacher I should say, and certainly that was the transition point when she retired. Retirement wasn't kind to her because the multiple sclerosis was starting to become more significant on the impact on her. Another benefit concert, she had one in 1919, there was another one in 1962, but that was in Newcastle as a means of providing her with some additional support. So she couldn't appear at the concert, but there was a taped message. And bringing this discussion to somewhat of a close, she died she spent a time in Lane Cove in Sydney. She actually moved to Sydney following some friends down, but the illness was becoming very difficult, so she came back to Newcastle at the end of 1967 and died at Annesley House. So I should say early in 1967, she died at Annesley House Nursing Home on the 15th of May 1968.
I think the sad part about it is that she was just known as Florence Austral. She adored her husband. They had separated. And when her mother died, on her plaque, her mother's plaque says, Mary Fawaz, mother of Florence Austral. Now, I went out to Beresfield and took the photo, and it just says Mary Amadio and the date of birth and death and nothing. And I'm thinking, this woman gave so much joy.
But that's what happens with group relationships, that they can be very little information on the past. I know that from my own experience.
Really?
So, yeah.
Yeah, but it's a tragedy that here in the university we do have the Florence Austral room, I think, in the conservatorium. And that's about it. And I think it's really important because as a singer myself, I listen to other singers, and it's really important to listen to their technique, how they did it. You know, she had an incredible agility. Now that would have helped with having her husband and partner as a flautist, because it really would have given her absolute clarity. Her breathing, her breath control is magnificent, the positioning of the voice. So all of these things, really, the students of today, even pop singers, need to sing properly. Otherwise, the voice lasts 5 minutes and it's gone. So when I say 5 minutes, it's a short period of time and then it's gone. Whereas a real singer, like, now I've got a blank, but there's Tom Jones, for example. He's a great singer. He would have learnt to sing properly. Freddie Mercury. Now he's another great pop singer. Cliff Richards. All these people would have had serious vocal training. So that's what I think.
Anyhow, out of our project, we believe there is merit in her having greater recognition. It's 50 years since she died. Next year it's 100 years since the benefit concert in Melbourne. 2021 is 100 years since the first concert at the Royal Albert Hall. There is a good legacy in recordings available on YouTube, and on that positive note, there is a resource that can be accessed, and she is recognised. We've got proof of her recognition in North America. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you.
Okay, over to Brian Walsh, who will talk about William and Elizabeth Paterson.
Sure. I'll try and keep it fairly tight. It's a big topic, but I'll just talk about a few aspects of it. William Paterson was the longest-serving official or officer in New South Wales right up until the time that Lachlan Macquarie took over in 1810. He was there from 1791 to 1810. He became head of the New South Wales Corps. He rose to the rank of colonel, the so-called Rum Corps, which became the 102nd Regiment before it was recalled. His career spans the official European exploration of the Lower Hunter Valley in 1801. He was in charge of the defence of Sydney in 1804 when during the Castle Hill Rebellion, in case the Irish rebels broke through from Parramatta. He governed on 2 occasions, once early on after Phillip left for health reasons, then Major Gross took over, he left for health reasons, and Paterson governed as a young man. And, well, no, he wasn't so young, but his wife, Elizabeth Paterson, she was only 24 when she was the First Lady, the Vice-Regal Consort in Government House in Sydney. So he also governed again right throughout 1809 after one of his officers had deposed Bligh in the so-called Rum Rebellion. It had very little to do with rum. He was Australia's first Fellow of the Royal Society, British peak body for the advancement of science. He was a protege of Sir Joseph Banks and corresponded with him regularly, sent him back material regularly. All right, so just briefly, I'll run through these slides. He was born in Connettles in Scotland, in County Angus in 1755. His wife, maiden name Elizabeth Driver, was born in nearby Montrose in 1770, so she was quite a bit younger than him. His first claim to fame was under the patronage of Countess Eleanor Bowes, who's a direct ancestor of Queen Elizabeth II. She paid him to explore within southern Africa from 1777 to 1779. He introduced the giraffe to the British public and to British science. He also introduced the thylacine and the koala because he was passionate about his natural history, mainly botany, but zoology as well. He explored further than any other European in that Cape area at that time, and he and a Dutchman named the Orange River. It was originally, before that, just called the Great River. He then had 2 tours of duty in India in the 1780s. The first tour of duty was at war with France, and he saw quite a bit of action, quite a bit of bloody action, fighting the French and then fighting some of the local Indian rulers as well. He arrived in Australia with his new wife Elizabeth in 1791. His first posting was to Norfolk Island. And just while we're on this map, I'll just talk briefly later about he claimed northern Tasmania for Britain in 1804, so that's just really just a thumbnail sketch of where he was in Australia. This is actually cut off a bit. Newcastle and Coal River is actually on this slide. It doesn't matter, you know where it is. I found that this is a full-size replica of the Lady Nelson, which I found in Hobart last year. Also had a beer at that bar on the right, which was very nice. But Lady Nelson's quite significant to the Paterson narrative in a couple of places. It was the ship that he travelled up to Newcastle in 1801 to explore the Lower Hunter Valley, and it was also one of the 3 ships that went down to northern Tasmania, then Van Diemen's Land in 1804. So I was absolutely delighted for the full-size replica. You can really appreciate what it was like. Now, I'll slow down a little bit for this and then just whip through the rest of them. This is my summation of very carefully reading his journal for July 1801. He and Grant and Borrelia and others came up, and their first job was to map Newcastle Harbour and to assess the local resources. But then in early July, he and Lewin broke away from Borrelia. Borrelia was still surveying and whatever, and they came up the what's now called the Hunter River and camped just below Hinton, and he named Shanks's Forest Plains below that. And I'll just tell you, on Shanks's Forest Plains, when I was researching for the book, I was reading George Johnson's letter books, which are only recently become available, and Admiral John Shanks wrote to him about 1806, I think, just after Blythe became governor, and said, "I believe I've got a forest plains named after me. Please get on the good side of Blythe, and so that name is retained." Well, it wasn't, obviously. It's gone. So, all right. So, from his campsite in early July, they walked overland. Now, the Paterson River, as it is today, Borrelia didn't survey it, and it's not on his 1801 map. The mouth of it is, where it enters the Hunter River is, and they referred to it as a deep creek. But you can, through the journal, you can accurately locate where their campsite was in relation to where the current Paterson River flows in. And I've overlaid Borrelia's map on Google Earth, and the Paterson River in that stretch there hasn't changed. The Hunter River has on all its windings, but the Paterson hasn't. So Paterson had heard that there was a big lagoon to the north, and he and Lewin walked up there in early July, and fortunately this satellite image was taken after heavy rain, and because Lake Paterson, if you know where to look, it's still there. It's all drained, but you can see all the low country and you can see where it was. Well, I just happened to fluke this satellite image was taken after heavy rain, and you can, no good pointing on there, you can't see where I'm pointing, but it's labelled on there just at the top. You can see sort of Lake Paterson has reappeared. William Paterson never set foot on today's Paterson River. He ordered some of his soldiers to drag a boat across from what they called the Deep Creek, into the lake, and they shot a few swans and other things. In those days, when you were studying natural history, if it was furry or had feathers, you shot it and either put it in a bottle of spirits, or if it was too big, you skinned it and kept the skeleton and the skin. So, okay, moving on. This is a painting he commissioned John Lewin to paint in 1809, but it's titled On the Banks of Paterson's River, which is the Hunter River. It's that campsite. And Johnny, I think you'll remember there was a marvellous presentation here called Mrs. Paterson's Scrapbook a couple of years ago, which explained the whole background of this series of paintings by John Lewin that Paterson commissioned in 1809 when he was about to leave the colony, and that's one of them. This is Joseph Lycett with Lake Paterson. Lycett has been criticised for stylising his paintings heavily and making them look like Europeans expected them to look, like European landscape. But that's Lake Paterson with Mount Johnson in the background, which is still a prominent feature behind Paterson, obviously. I don't know how clear that is at that level of magnification, but I just put it up there to reinforce that the river names have changed. What's now the Williams River was the Hunter, and what's now the Hunter above Raymond Terrace was Paterson's River. It's probably a bit clearer there. When Borrelia was first there in mid-1801, as I said, he called it a deep creek. He came back at the end of 1801 and actually went up today's Paterson River, surveyed it up as far as Vasey and called it a new river. Robert Brown, the botanist, went up the river in 1804, and just to confuse things even further, he called it Williams River. Macquarie in 1818 went up there and he didn't even bother with names, he just called them first, second and third branch. So just out of interest, the first map I can find where today's namings are used is Dangar in 1823, where he writes Paterson's River for what is now the Paterson River. It may have happened a little bit earlier, but it certainly hadn't happened in 1818 when Macquarie was there. Now, okay, quickly, this is Paterson Monument on the Tamar River, Georgetown, northern Tasmania. And it says, this is the plaque on the seaward side of that. Close to this memorial, Lieutenant Colonel William Paterson, New South Wales Corps, landed from HMS Buffalo on the 11th of November 1804 and took possession of the Northern Territory of Van Diemen's Land in the name of His Britannic Majesty King George III. Very keen on that Paterson history in northern Tasmania, probably more so than we are here. There's quite a lot of enthusiastic people. That's Paterson established Yorktown on the western side of the Tamar. We had a government house, convict barracks and whatever. It's just an archaeological site now. And it was only for about 4 years, and then they moved to Launceston. He founded Launceston. As I said, he introduced the thylacine to British science. I think he sent a skin and skeleton back to Banks. Almost finished, and this might seem a strange image to put up. This is on what's now Circular Quay. It was the commissariat store designed by Joseph Favreau and commenced under Paterson's rebel government in 1809. So this was after Blythe was deposed, and it was during the rebel government period. Magnificent stone building, and notice it's on the water. Here it is it survived into the 1930s. Here it is in late 1930s, just before it was demolished, and you can see there's been a lot of land reclamation. There's now a road in front of it. That site became the Maritime Services Board building, which is now the Museum of Contemporary Art. So up until, it just really followed my imagination that up until 1939 there was a direct link back to Paterson's governorship in 1809. Elizabeth Paterson in middle age, and she had the distinction. William Paterson died in 1810 on the way back to Britain. She married his old commanding officer, Major Gross, who died a couple of months later. And this is her gravestone in Liverpool, England, and it says Elizabeth Gross. Anyway, she's the widow of Lieutenant General Gross, etc., died 1839, aged 69. So I'm very pleased to be able to get that. Most of the gravestones in that cemetery have been removed, nearly all of them in fact, so I was very lucky. That's it. I've tried to move through quickly in terms of time. There's a lot more to the story. I'll just say one more thing. Elizabeth Paterson was very much an independent woman in her own right. She helped establish the Sydney Female Orphan School in 1801 along with Anna Josepha King, and they were the first women in Australia to manage a public institution. Thank you.
At the end, what I've got here is a book, and it's called Land Settlement in New South Wales. It is the definitive book, I should say, I believe, on land settlement. I'll very quickly tell you the story behind it. It's written by a local Newcastle surveyor whose name was Ian Marshall. He had a private practice in Cessnock for many years. About the last 30 years of his life, his passion was to try and pass on some surveying knowledge to young surveying graduates and help them get through their Board of Surveyors exams, something you do 2 years after graduation. And Ian proceeded to make notes and CDs and various things for people. Ian died 1 year ago. Now, his wife, I knew Ian very well for many years. We often shared a car to Sydney, very often. And his wife said, come over and have a look through his library for me. I want to get rid of all this stuff. And all this stuff was in the preparation of this book. He meticulously, chapter by chapter, got all the notes from Macquarie and from Philip and from whoever to Thomas Mitchell and all those instructions and logged them into lovely folders. I collected the lot and gave them to Joni, and they're in the archives. So all the source materials in the University archives. That was a year ago. It's taken just on a year to publish the book because there was, because he passed away, there was, well, it's going to cost a lot of money, oh, who's going to do it, you know, who's going to kick the can. And anyway, the bottom line is it has been published, and not surprisingly, perhaps it's gone like hotcakes. I believe there are only 20 copies of it left. The people who published it in the end are called the Association of Consulting Surveyors. They're in Sydney, and the best way to do it is just to get onto Google and say Association of Consulting Surveyors. The book cost $80. They will also send it to your house for about $10, as they've done with mine. It's about 200 pages long. It's in a beautiful format. It's been printed by the Lands Department people, and lovely illustrations and maps to illustrate it. And it answers all those questions. One question we had here a few years ago was by Russell, I think. He said to me, John, what's 100? You know, because when they started to settle, in this book, land settlement in New South Wales, basically meant Australia, you know, we had the state of New South Wales, and then we had counties, and then we had parishes. We all understood the parishes around the towns. The counties were like the county of Cumberland and Northumberland, they're bigger things. Well, what were the hundreds? And I said, Russell, they were just 100 square miles. There's another way of breaking it up. Upon reading this book, I discovered I was wrong. 100 is a medieval term coming from Saxon England, put out by Alfred the Great in 987. 100 referred to 100 hides, H-I-D-E-S. A hide is a medieval area of land equal to 120 acres. 120 acres was what was decided back in the year 900 that a man and his family would need to farm and be sustainable on. And so in the original breaking up, they decided to break into counties 100s and then parishes. They never got round to adopting that 120 acre thing, and they went back to the 100 square miles when they cut up Australia. What's also very interesting is that, of course, the British have been in America and cut America, as we know, into a grid. All the towns have got roads at right angles, north, south, east, west, and so on. And everybody had either a square mile, 640 acres, or 320, and then 40 acres, and then cut into quarters, and then a quarter acre block, and everything was divided by 4. Well, it was in the 1820s in Australia that they thought, you know, what we did in America wasn't such a bad idea. It was pretty easy to keep tabs on everything, so let's adopt that. So the policy from Australia, which was, you know, you can have a grant of land and do a free convict, you can go and get some, and they decided to regularise it. And of course, this is a surveyor's perspective, and the poor old surveyors were in the middle, getting grants of land on the left and having to cut things up regularly on the right. Anyway, that's the story. The book's there. It's $80. The Association of Consulting Surveyors in Sydney, the only people that have got copies because they're the ones who printed it, and there are 20 left when I just went and looked on the website a minute ago.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Johnny. Since our last meeting, there's been some significant anniversaries of military history related to Newcastle and Hunter Valley. On the 13th of May, it was the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Pfizer Base Coral in South Vietnam. Now, you may have seen the service and coverage of this on national television. There was 11 Australians killed in action, including Private Errol John Bailey from Kurri, the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, and his ashes at the Beresfield Crematorium. 3 days later, on the 16th of May 1968, 50 years ago, the Battle of Fire Support Base Balmoral in South Vietnam, and one of the Australians killed was Private Alan John Wallace, 1st Battalion RAR from Wingham. He lived in Kitchener-Parade in Newcastle, and he was repatriated from Vietnam, and he's buried in the Methodist Cemetery of Sandgate Cemetery. On the 14th of May 1943, or 75 years ago, it was the 14th of May, the 75th anniversary of the sinking of the hospital ship Centaur off the southeast Queensland coast. There was 269 Australian nurses and field ambulancement perished at sea after the Centaur was sunk by a Japanese submarine's torpedo. 10 field ambulance men and 2 nurses from Newcastle were amongst the 269 that died. On the 16th of May 1943, or 75 years ago, it was the 75th anniversary of the 617 RAF Squadron Dam Busters raid in the Ruhr Valley of Germany. And I think there was 13 Australian Air Force men included in that raid, and there was 2 Newcastle men, and actually one of them, Flight Lieutenant Jack French Lithgow from Spears Point, was awarded the bar to the Distinguished Flying Cross because Flight Lieutenant Lithgow was the navigator. He actually trained the navigators of that raid on navigating skills and things. This week, the 7th of June, is the centenary of the arrival in Newcastle and the finish of the March to Freedom, which began in Armidale and finished here in Newcastle 100 weeks. Also, back on the 24th of May, it was the 75th anniversary of the crash of the Catalina A2439 in the coast of Port Stephens. Of the 9-man crew, 7 were killed, and those 7 are buried in Sandgate War Cemetery. And amongst those 7 killed were 2 men, both from Toronto.
Thank you very much.
May they rest in eternal peace.
I just add one.
Yes.
Friday is the 76th anniversary of the attack by the I-21 on Newcastle.
I wanted to bring to your attention the Heritage Council's website and the registrar Register, the New South Wales Register, SHR 1764, that's the Coal River precinct, and the themes, the heritage themes of that precinct. Now, they haven't been updated since 2003, and the Living Histories here in Newcastle has prepared a massive amount of material since our operation, and that needs to be added to the website, and we need to get a link to our website from the New South Wales Heritage site. That's all. I want to discuss those matters with it. There's not time to do it now, but anybody can look at that. Just Google 1674 Coal River Precinct, and you'll have all the information concerning Nobbies, the fort, and so on. There is a link, incidentally, to the fort group.
Hang on.
The reason for this is that decisions are being made, and people, of course, naturally, anyone that's making a decision has to officially notify the Heritage Council, and they have to look at the website. Well, they're not getting all the information because
all right,
it's here.
We've got to contact OEH about something else, so we'll ask them about updating information on the. Okay. Now I've got Suzanne and then Keith. All right.
Yeah, but I didn't quite hear all what they were saying. You're talking about the army duck. No, you're not. Okay. I was going to say that late last year, Don McCarthy, who was involved with that incident when the George Medalford died, and I went to council about it, pointing out he had. He was an interesting person in the community, but there's no obituary. But I just wanted to point out to you too, David, that when the council axed their community awards in 2011 without a council resolution and like that, freedom of the city at that time was axed as well, and also the freedom of the city given to military units and naval units and the like. And so theoretically, that won't ever happen again, because if someone decided to save a buck by getting rid of it. Yeah, I just thought and also in 2008, my last year on council got an independent heritage advisor to look at all our LEP listings, because some of them are listed as state significant, although an LEP listing is supposed to be only for locally significant items. And that person then looked at about 50 or 60 of them and assessed them as to whether they should be on the state heritage registers, but 30 of them, I think, were assessed as being suitable. 10 years on, I don't think any of them have made their way to the State Heritage Register. Things go slowly.
Okay, thank you.
You may remember that I've been very interested in one of the columns from the original 1840s courthouse, which for many years stood in Parnell Place. So I've recently, the day after our last meeting, had a letter from Claire Nader, Precinct Facility Manager, Infrastructure and Facilities Services, Newcastle University. Thank you for your letter regarding the Corinthian column. Unfortunately, it is not possible to accommodate this column at our campus in New Space. We will have to kindly decline this offer. Thank you for getting in touch and for sending photos. So I guess the column will remain locked up in the museum somewhere forever and ever now. So, end of story. And can I just say very quickly that in July, August this year, it will be 200 years since Lachlan Macquarie visited Newcastle, and he did a lot of travelling around with James Wallace, the Commandant. And maybe I could talk a little bit more about at the next meeting what he did while he was up here at that time.
Okay. Thank you very much, Suzanne.